Success leaves clues, but so does failure. Some of history's best-known commanders are remembered not for their brilliant victories, but for their catastrophic blunders. Throughout the centuries, countless armies have gone down to defeat. A few armies have been defeated because of the blundering incompetence of their own commanders. So what are the elements of leadership failure? A recurrent pattern emerges over the last 2,000 plus years. See if you can identify the key ingredient to self-induced failure as we look at some of America's worst generals. Let's start with John Armstrong Jr. in the War of 1812. On June the 14th, 1813, President James Madison named Brigadier General John Armstrong Jr. as Secretary of War. Armstrong had not been a general very long, having only been commissioned a brigadier in 1812 at the outbreak of war with England. This was based on his service as a junior officer during the Revolution. Well, what Armstrong lacked in military experience, he made up for in political muscle. He was a former senator from New York and a powerful figure in New York politics. Despite his relative inexperience, Armstrong fancied himself a military genius. In 1814, he wrote a book called Hints to Young Generals. This book became widely popular and added to his reputation as the country's foremost military expert. Some of his New York associates knew better, however, describing his chief attributes as obstinacy and self-conceit. Well, on April the 11th, 1814, as the victorious Allied armies marched into Paris, the Emperor Napoleon abdicated. Now, thousands of battle-hardened British troops were available for service against America. President Monroe called an emergency meeting of his cabinet on July the 1st, as the threat of a British invasion became imminent. The president told the cabinet that he wanted 3,000 militiamen deployed between Washington and the Chesapeake Bay, with another 12,000 on alert in the nearby area. The regular army, some 27,000 regulars, was spread thinly from Canada to Louisiana. Well, no one objected to the president's request. John Armstrong had no need to argue. He simply ignored the president. He also ignored the request of his ground commander, General William Winder, to mobilize the local militia so that they could train. Armstrong, the self-styled military genius, had a theory that militia fought best at the spur of the moment. He said that early deployment would only cause militiamen to brood over the horrors of battle. In addition to his theory on the use of troops, Armstrong's strategic sense told him that the British would never attack Washington, an insignificant rural town of 8,000, when richer prizes awaited. By God, he proclaimed, they would not come with such a fleet without meaning to strike somewhere, but they certainly will not come here. What the devil would they do here? No, Baltimore is the place, sir. That is so much more consequence. Armstrong had a few lonely critics, but few dared question the Secretary of War, who obviously had access to military intelligence, which gave him greater insight into matters. Well, Armstrong steadfastly refused to do anything to defend the United States Capitol. When residents of St. Mary's County, Maryland, pleaded for help in the face of several British raids, Armstrong replied, "It cannot be expected that I can defend every man's turnip patch." When President Madison finally reprimanded him for not doing enough to defend the Capitol just days before the invasion, the obstinate Armstrong did even less. The British landed at Benedict, Maryland on August the 19th, 1814, achieving complete tactical surprise. The British marched rapidly north. The American army, such as it was, wasted time marching and countermarching, achieving nothing but the exhaustion of the militia. When battle was finally joined on August the 24th, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. 4,500 British veterans faced 429 American regulars and 1,500 poorly trained and poorly equipped militia in a set-piece battle in the open. The British regulars came on steadily, driving the Americans like sheep. After losing 10 dead and 40 wounded, the Americans fled the field, leaving 10 cannons behind. The rout was complete and was derided at the time as the Bladensburg races. The battle has gone down to history as the greatest disgrace ever dealt American arms and the most humiliating episode in American history. Well, the remnants of the American army fled towards Washington, with the British in hot pursuit. When asked what he intended to do, Armstrong shifted blame to the ground commander, General Winder, for the disaster, commenting that surely General Winder has formed plans for defending the city. General Winder took his remaining troops to the high ground around Georgetown, leaving most of present-day Washington to the British. The British burned Washington that night. The glow from the burning city could be seen 40 miles away in Baltimore. With the city of Washington in flames, 22 wagon loads of United States documents made their way across the Potomac River into Northern Virginia. John Armstrong retired to his home in Red Hook, New York, and died there in 1843. Today, Armstrong's portrait hangs in the corridors of the Pentagon, along with other secretaries of war and defense, only some of whom have learned the lessons of history. Now let's turn to another infamous or famously bad general, and that is George Armstrong Custer. In the spring of 1876, war erupted on the American Great Plains between a coalition of Native American tribes and the United States. In June, Brigadier General Alfred Terry, in overall command of the campaign, led a column marching west out of North Dakota with the intention of linking up with columns commanded by Brigadier General George Crook, moving up from the south, and Colonel John Gibbon, moving eastward. The strategic plan for defeating the Indians called for the three columns to trap the bulk of the Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne warriors between them in a so-called hammer and anvil deployment, and to destroy the hostiles in one big battle. Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer, now he was a brevet or temporary major general in theater, was originally designated to lead one of the three columns, but he was relieved by the orders of President Ulysses S. Grant because he'd been meddling in politics. Well, after much begging on the part of Custer, the president allowed Custer to rejoin the campaign, but only as commander of his own regiment, the 7th U.S. Cavalry. Terry sent Custer and his 600 men forward to scout the enemy's position. Terry's orders were broad, allowing Custer a large measure of discretion. Allowing Custer so much discretion was unfortunate, for he was not a man known for either prudence or discretion. George Armstrong Custer was no military novice in 1876. Custer graduated from West Point in 1861 and distinguished himself in the American Civil War as a brave cavalry officer, being promoted to the rank of temporary brigadier general in 1863 and temporary major general in 1865. Custer's friends made much of the fact that he was a boy general, but such honors were fairly common during the Civil War. In fact, two of Custer's subordinate officers in the 1876 campaign, Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen, had been given similar honors during the Civil War. Reno was made a brevet brigadier general in 1865, and by the end of the war, Benteen had been recommended to receive the rank of brevet brigadier general. Unlike many other brave soldiers, however, Custer had a knack for publicity. He frequently invited correspondents from leading newspapers to accompany his campaigns, and their reporting significantly enhanced his visibility and reputation. Well, Custer put on quite a show for the press, sporting flamboyant uniforms and long hair worn in ringlets sprinkled with cinnamon-scented hair oil. In his manner of dress and command, he was not unlike Jeb Stuart, the flamboyant commander of General Robert E. Lee's Confederate cavalry. The North needed its own Stuart, and Custer cast himself in the role of the North's dashing cavalier. While no one could question Custer's personal bravery or flamboyance, his tactics were weak. His one basic tactic was to charge the enemy wherever he might be, no matter how strong his position or how large his numbers. On the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, for example, Custer, without any reconnaissance, attacked a force 4 times his size. Custer was personally cited for gallantry, although his brigade suffered the highest loss of any Union cavalry brigade engaged at Gettysburg. Custer's reputation was bought with the dead bodies of his men. So, when Custer rode out in 1876, he went out with intelligence provided by heretofore reliable Indian agents. He expected to find 1,500 indifferently armed Indian warriors. He wasn't concerned about numbers. He was more concerned that the enemy would slip away. In fact, Custer refused the support offered by General Terry of an additional 4 companies from the 2nd Cavalry. Custer stated that he could whip any Indian village on the plains with his own regiment, and that extra troops would simply be a burden. The facts on the ground contradicted the intelligence upon which Custer had relied. On June the 25th, Custer's Indian scouts identified what they claimed was a large Indian encampment along the Little Bighorn River. Custer decided to attack despite the warning from Mitch Boyer, a veteran scout of French and Sioux descent, that this was the largest gathering of Indians that he had seen in more than 30 years. In fact, Custer was facing some 5,000 warriors. Well, one clue to Custer's personality was his addiction to high-stakes gambling. Custer was known to bet $1,000, that's $21,000 in today's money, in a poker game on a bluff hand and lose, or to bet $500 on a horse race and win. The rush he got from high-risk play was addictive, and he was only inconsistently able to overcome the urge, although he proclaimed from time to time that he was able to resist the temptation. So Custer's out on the plains. He divides his regiment into 3 battalions. Benteen was sent south and west to cut off any attempted escape by the Indians. Reno was to charge the southern end of the encampment, and Custer was going to ride north, planning to circle around and attack the camp from the north. Reno began a charge on the southern end of the village, but the Indians did not flee as expected. They began pouring out of the village toward Reno like so many angry bees. Reno halted, had his men dismount, and formed a skirmish line. The Sioux and Cheyenne warriors in huge numbers began to flank Reno's position, and he beat a hasty retreat, or as he reported it, a charge to the rear. Barely escaping massacre, Reno established a defensive position atop the bluffs overlooking the river and made a successful stand against the attacking Indians. Custer attempted to ford the river at the north end of the camp, but was driven off. Now hundreds of warriors pursued the soldiers onto a ridge north of the encampment. Custer's men were unable to dig in, however, because they had been outflanked by the Indians, who were now to their north at the crest of the ridge. Custer had fallen victim to the same hammer and anvil tactic that he envisioned springing on the Indians. At this point, Custer might have saved a remnant of his command by charging to the rear, as Reno had done. But for whatever reason, he chose not to do that. At a court of inquiry, Captain Benteen testified, "I think discretion would have been the better part of valor had he done that." As it was, Custer and the 210 men under his immediate command were all killed. At the other end of the field, things were equally desperate. Benteen, who had been called back by Custer, came upon the beleaguered forces of Reno and halted. At this point, Captain Thomas Weir, disobeying orders to remain with Reno's command, rode to the sounds of battle in an attempt to support Custer. Some minutes later, Weir was joined by Benteen and Reno. Well, the would-be rescuers were set upon by a large party of Sioux warriors and barely made it back to Reno's entrenched position, where they were besieged for a day and a half before being relieved by General Terry. Reno and Benteen lost 50 men. News of the disaster on the Little Bighorn hit America in the midst of the centennial of independence festivities. Newspapers heralded Custer as a Christian knight martyred in the cause of civilization. The military verdict was less favorable. General Phil Sheridan wrote, "I deeply deplore the loss of Custer and his men. I feel it was an unnecessary sacrifice due to misapprehension and a superabundance of courage." President Grant, no desk soldier himself, pronounced, "I regard Custer's massacre as a sacrifice of troops brought on by Custer himself that was wholly unnecessary." Wholly unnecessary. Well, one of Custer's famous buckskin coats is on display at the National Museum of American History in Washington. And if this presentation has made you a Custer fan, you may want to run down there and have a look. Now, I think we have time to talk about one more really bad general, and that is William Hull. Just before the outbreak of the War of 1812, President Madison appointed William Hull a brigadier general in command of the newly created Army of the Northwest. A contemporary described the new brigadier general as a short, silver-haired, pleasant old gentleman who bore the marks of good eating and drinking. Now, that's what you want in a general. As tensions between Britain and the United States grew, it became clear that Detroit could serve as a jumping-off place for the invasion of Canada. The United States declared war on Great Britain on June the 18th, 1812. Congressional leaders anticipated little resistance in Canada and expected the campaign to be little more than marching in and taking possession. William Hull launched the invasion of Canada on July the 12th, 1812, issuing a proclamation offering Canadians liberation from the tyranny of Great Britain if they cooperated, and a war of extermination if they did not. The small British garrison at Fort Malden fled, and the Americans occupied the village of Sandwich, modern Windsor, Ontario. The British continued to occupy the fort at Amhertsburg and the territory around it. After some indecisive skirmishes, Hull decided he could not attack the British fort without artillery. The morale of the defenders began to improve, while Hull became the prey of his own doubts and fears. Hull worried that the long supply lines to Detroit were vulnerable. He worried he lacked naval support. He worried that another American force farther east could not help him by drawing off British strength. His worst fear was the Indians. He warned Canadians, if the savages are let loose to murder our citizens and butcher our women and children, this war will be a war of extermination. After issuing the proclamation, Hull began to worry that it was too strong and might result in ferocious reprisals by the British and Indians. Worst yet was news that British regulars were sailing from New York against him. To the disgust of his officers, Hull retreated from Canada and took up defensive positions at Detroit on August the 8th. Well, on August the 13th, Major General Isaac Brock and the British Relief Column arrived. Brock did not command the large force Hull feared. In fact, he only had 400 regular and militia troops, supported by 700 lightly armed Native Americans. Brock intended to subdue the stronghold of Detroit, garrisoned by 2,500 men, securely situated behind 22-foot ramparts and a palisade of 10-foot hardwood spikes, all defended by 33 cannons and an 8-foot moat. Well, how was he to do this? Brock attacked the American center of gravity, which in this case was the mind of the American commander. Having captured some of Hull's dispatches, Brock knew that American morale was low and that Hull was discouraged. Playing on Hull's almost hysterical fear of Indians, Brock began a campaign of psychological warfare. The British played on Hull's fear of the Indians by arranging for a letter to fall into American hands, which asked that no more Indians be allowed to proceed, as he already had no less than 5,000, and supplies were running low. Brock sent a demand for surrender. Brock's demand for surrender was rejected. The British began bombarding Fort Detroit. The Americans returned fire. 7 Americans were killed, and 2 British gunners wounded in the exchange. On the night of August the 15th, some 500 Native American warriors paddled across the unguarded river and landed below Detroit. The British infantry and militia followed at daylight. Hull, who had led a heroic bayonet charge during the Revolution, was totally out of his depth in overall command and began to crack, seemingly besieged by overwhelming British forces and Indians. Hearing the Indian war cries approaching, Hull began to fear a massacre. Women and children, including his own daughter and granddaughter, were inside the fort, giving his fears even more weight. Well, at 10 a.m., a white flag appeared over the fort. Despite the protests of his officers and men, William Hull surrendered his entire army without a fight. Hull was exchanged for a high-ranking British prisoner of war, only to face court-martial charges of treason, cowardice, neglect of duty, and unofficer-like conduct. He was found guilty, and he was sentenced to be shot. President Madison commuted the death sentence. But William Hull remains the only American general to have ever been sentenced to death by a court-martial.